those are two branches of occultism, one which is called thaumaturgy and one which is called theurgy, two which are entirely different in their objectives. Theurgy would have to do with whenever you're using these occult methods as methods for inner transformation, self-knowledge, and ultimately towards your liberation, then that would constitute a theurgy. Thaumaturgy is like what you were mentioning a little bit earlier, when you would be using these methods just for self-gratification and almost entirely selfish purposes, which does often and always, I shouldn't say often, it always leads to the strengthening of the ego. So what we're using in this Deity Yoga is, of course, oriented towards theurgy, where you're using these metaphors and images as devices for inner transformation. Now, do these energies that you're dealing with, are they just entirely subjective, or do they have an objective reality? And my understanding is that it's both. It's both. What is the common principle that's running beneath both the subjective and the objective? Is energy and vibration, right? So by awakening certain forces within you, it is possible to also awaken certain forces without you, externally in the world. So this gives some, which anyway, whether you awaken them or don't awaken them, these vibrations and these levels of energy are already there in the cosmos. So the only question is, do you have access to them or not? In fact, every human being, whether they're conscious of it or not conscious of it, is a magician, because you're doing this all the time. As a result of awakening certain desires and certain forces within you, you're also, in a similar sense, manifesting those desires in the external world, and as a consequence, you're attracting certain forces towards you. So it is actually true when it has said that man is a microcosm in the macrocosm. It also gives a more mystical meaning behind the old Christian sentiment that the human being is created in the image of God. Not God, if you're looking at it in a more mystical light, it's not God in the sense of a supreme being, but the absolute reality that we have the storehouse of cosmic energies that exists within us, which is exactly like a mirror reflection of the energies that exist in the cosmos. So that's precisely what's behind this Deity Yoga. You're reinforcing a certain image, which is the image of the deity. The root of it is that you're trying to uproot from the very ground certain particular afflictive emotions: greed, anger, ignorance, self-doubt, fear, jealousy, envy. So to combat those afflictive emotions, you need to apply the necessary antidotes. So what are these images of the deities? In one sense, you can look at it as it's a metaphor for prescribing for a particular antidote. So if somebody is, let's say, suffering from tremendous greed, he can invoke the energy of Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha of compassion. If he's suffering from laziness and lethargy, he can invoke the energy of Vajrapani, the Buddha of power, or the power of an enlightened consciousness. Or if he's suffering from dullness of the intellect, then he can invoke Manjushri, the Buddha of wisdom. So like this, you're applying particular remedies to address particular symptoms, and that is what we're doing with this Deity Yoga. Now, of course, the danger is as we've discussed many times, it's if you're awakening certain psychological forces which you're not balanced and matured enough to handle, then those psychological forces can just simply rule over you, in which case we can say the individual is so-called possessed. Is he possessed by some intelligence that has an objective reality? As we've discussed before, that's debatable. How do you know these energies have an objective personality and consciousness? There's no way to verify this. My own attitude towards this is that I'm absolutely agnostic about that possibility. I don't say yes because there's not sufficient evidence to prove their existence, and I don't say no because then it would be depriving yourself of being receptive to that possibility. But one thing I do know for certain is that they do have an objective existence. It's just that the question of whether they have a consciousness or a personality is debatable. But that is the danger. And it can also create a forking, a split in your personality, where you start to become identified with that particular form, and then your ego is kind of decorated with the idea of the deity. And then you start believing that you're a god in the human body, or that you're some kind of messiah. So that is the danger, which is why always when we're practicing these methods of deity yoga, we have certain safety guards that are in place. One, which is the realization of Shunya, that the image of the deity is, the real nature of the deity is fundamentally empty. It has no permanent center of being, and it has no independent reality of its own, just like everything else in the cosmos. Whether it's a tree, whether it's a flower, whether it's an ant, whether it's a worm, whether it's the stars, the planets, billions of galaxies, all of it fundamentally empty. They don't have any independent reality. So then what's the point in becoming too identified with these forms? You're just falling into delusion if you miss this understanding of Shunya. And the second safety guard that's in place is compassion. Think of how many conflicts have been created, not just in the spiritual process, but also, let's say, between false masters and disciples. People who are passing themselves off as certain gurus and masters, knowing very well that, let's say, they're deceiving the disciple, and this could have been avoided if only there was a genuine spirit of compassion. How would these, unless, of course, the so-called guru is genuinely deceiving himself, then he's just suffering from self-deception. That doesn't make him a charlatan, and it doesn't make him a fraud, but it makes him genuinely self-deluded. But that's tremendously important quality, is the spirit of compassion, regardless of what kind of method that you're practicing. But of course, when it comes to deity yoga, it's especially powerful. So I want you to enter into this deity yoga with the right mindset, the right understanding, knowing the risks that are involved, knowing the potentials that are involved, and if you equip yourself with the right psychology, then in a very short amount of time, these methods can offer tremendous rapid acceleration along the path. But at the heart of it, these two concepts should be driven home. The understanding of Shunya, absolute emptiness, and the significance of a compassionate consciousness. So then these so-called occult methods, which have been so often condemned, can be tremendously potent medicine. And that's one of the reasons why, in fact, it has been secretive. Because anything that has a tremendous power or potential can also go on the wrong track. It's a double-edged sword. On one hand, it can provide tremendous inspiration and transformation, and on the other hand, it can awaken a hellish nightmare that you're just unable to handle, and then you just fall into insanity or psychological ailments which are very difficult to rectify. So for this reason, these methods have always been transmitted secretly from master to disciple. One reason is because of the psychological and in many cases physical risks that are involved. The second is that to preserve the spirit of the teachings, to make sure that they wouldn't be corrupted in the wrong hands. And thirdly, because, in our Western society, which is so much influenced by the Abrahamic traditions, anything that's non-Christian or non-Jewish, anything that's non-Abrahamic is automatically condemned as satanic among many people who are very die-hard followers of that path. So why invite the unnecessary persecution from the society? But some people think, because it's secretive, you must be doing something wrong. You need these kind of safety guards in place. It's kind of like, imagine you're involved in the work of chemistry and you enter into the laboratory with all these tools and devices at your disposal, and you're just messing around here and there, randomly combining chemicals together without a fuller understanding of what's involved. It's tremendous power at your disposal, but tremendously dangerous as well if you don't know what you're doing. So a chemistry professor is not just going to give all these substances available to just about anybody, right? You have to learn chemistry. You have to learn, okay, what's the value of this chemical? What's the potential of this other chemical? What can they be used for? What they cannot be used for, right? So this is the case in our modern science. We have safety guards in place to prevent the corruption of genuine science from degenerating into superstition, and also to maintain the integrity of the practice. So that's easy to understand with the sciences. Why should it be so difficult to understand when it comes to occult sciences? It's precisely the same. Do you agree?
Yeah. I think it's very special that we have such energy that with such substance that we can affect each other with just our mind and develop certain kind of energy between us. Because I have moments, where I realize how thinking about someone can make them, call me out of nowhere, like for someone that I haven't talked to for a very long time. And or just your energy, how it affects other people. If you're depressed, very neurotic energy or whatever, you can sense it too. So how it works at a short distance, at a long distance, and how we can develop them and cultivate such whatever kind of energy and qualities you want in you, and how it can actually affect the world near you or far away.
Yes. It's generally understood that the mind is a product of the environment, but rarely is it understood that also the mind is infusing its own qualities into the environment, which does create a chain reaction of cause and effect. That's another way that you can understand this. I mean, where does the chain of cause and effect start, and where does it stop? Does it just start with the inner world? Does it just start with the external world? Does it just end with the inner world? Does it just end in the external world? It's a collision of many causes and many effects, right? Where can we draw truly the dividing lines from where the internal world begins and where the external world ends? Especially if you're going to be talking about the so-called absolute reality, which is supposed to be immeasurable and omnipresent, then these distinctions of what is internal and external no longer become so relevant. And my understanding is that this is somewhat reflected in some of our modern science, such as, and I'm very careful to draw similarities to modern science, because this has been so badly abused, where some people who have a mystical orientation, they're sort of hijacking modern science and cherry picking it to fit into their belief system. So I try to avoid doing that. But on the other hand, I do see some striking phenomena that points towards the same reality. For instance, there's this phenomena which has been talked about, well known, of the quantum entanglement. When two particles come into contact with each other, even after a time when they've been separated, one particle may be galaxies apart, another particle also galaxies apart, and yet in spite of the distance, when a change happens to one particle with its partner particle faster than the speed of light, instantaneous reaction, a corresponding change happens to the other particle, regardless of the distance of time and the distance of space. So somehow these particles, in spite of the distance, there's some kind of underlying reality which connects everything, in spite of the fact that there's different shapes, different forms, different realities happening in different spaces. So all of this is pointing towards the same message we've talked about many times, which is the death of dualism. that dualism is just a mental impression in the mind. And if we understand that, then it makes understanding how all of these sort of mystical or occult phenomena much more easier to digest. But still, we need scientific standards in place, because it's very easy that this can just turn into a road to madness, right? You have to exercise your discrimination. You need a scientific standard to separate the wheat from the chaff, to know the difference between what is your mental projection on the reality and what is the actual reality. So that's why cultivating this quality of viveka, or discrimination of the intellect, is still especially important when we're dealing with these occult methods.